The probate lawyer didn't even look up when he told me my mother had left the lakeside cottage, the only thing of value she owned, entirely to my younger sister, Marisol. I sat there in a chair that creaked under the slightest shift of weight, clutching a chipped ceramic bird I'd rescued from Mom's bedside table, realizing that 30 years of being the reliable daughter had been worth exactly nothing. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle, like dry leaves. "I've paid the property taxes for the last decade. I paid for the new roof. I'm the one who moved back to nurse her through the final 3 years while Marisol was traveling." Mr. Henderson finally looked at me over his spectacles. There was no pity in his eyes, only the weary boredom of a man who spent his life watching families tear themselves apart over dirt and timber. "The will is ironclad, Linnea. Executed 6 months ago. Your mother was of sound mind. She explicitly stated that you already had the gift of stability, and that Marisol needed the foundation more." The gift of stability. That was Mom's code for the fact that I worked 48 hours a week at the clinic, kept my kitchen floor scrubbed, and never asked her for a dime. Marisol's lack of foundation, meanwhile, was a polite way of describing a 34-year-old woman who still treated life like a series of vibrant, expensive accidents. I walked out of the office into the stifling heat of a late July afternoon. The air felt thick, tasting of asphalt and incoming rain. I drove straight to the cottage. It sat nestled among the birches, the silver wood siding glowing in the fading light. It was the only place I ever felt I could breathe, a sanctuary of childhood summers and quiet mornings. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw Marisol's beat-up yellow convertible already parked there. Music, something rhythmic and loud, was thumping from inside the house. The front door was wide open, letting in the mosquitoes. I stepped onto the porch, my chest tightening. I found Marisol in the living room, tossing Mom's hand-knit throw pillows into a cardboard box marked trash. "Hey, Nee," she chirped, not even looking at me. She smelled like expensive cigarettes and coconut tanning oil. "Glad you're here. You can help me decide which walls to knock down. I'm thinking of an open-concept rental. High-end. Heirloom gold mine, right?" I looked at the pillows on the floor, the ones Mom had worked on during her first round of chemo. "You're selling it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Marisol paused, a smirk playing on her lips. "Not selling, investing. I finally have a real start, Nee. Don't tell me you're going to be bitter about it." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized the war hadn't started today. It had started years ago, and I was the only one who hadn't realized I was losing. Marisol didn't wait for my answer. She moved toward the kitchen, her bangles clinking, a bright, metallic sound that grated against the silence of the woods outside. She pulled a bottle of wine from her bag, one I knew cost more than the groceries I'd bought for Mom every week for 3 years. She didn't offer me a glass. "Mom knew what she was doing," Marisol said, struggling with the cork. "She knew you were settled. You have your little house in town, your steady shifts. You're safe. I'm the one who's been struggling to find my feet." "You've been finding your feet on 3 different continents with money Mom didn't have," I replied, standing by the fireplace. My hand traced the mantel, feeling the fine layer of dust that had gathered since the funeral. "I spent my savings keeping this place from being foreclosed on while she was sick. I have receipts, Marisol. I have logs of every medication, every repair." Marisol finally popped the cork with a triumphant thwack. She took a long swig directly from the bottle before looking at me, her eyes, so much like our mother, but without the softness, narrowed. "And that's your problem, Nee. You think life is an invoice. You think if you put in enough hours, you're owed the world. Mom didn't want a bookkeeper. She wanted a daughter who actually lived." The cruelty of it was so casual it felt like a physical blow. I thought of the nights I'd spent sleeping on the floor next to Mom's bed, listening to her labored breathing, whispering stories to her while Marisol's postcards from Ibiza sat unread on the nightstand. "I'm staying here tonight," I said, my voice hardening. Marisol laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Actually, I've already changed the codes on the security system, and I'm having the locks tumbled tomorrow. You can take your little ceramic bird and whatever else you've managed to scavenge, but this is my house now. Legally. Totally. Finally." She walked past me, intentionally brushing her shoulder against mine, and headed toward the master bedroom, the room that still smelled like Mom's lavender soap and illness. I stood in the fading light of the living room, staring at the box of trash on the floor. My eyes fell on an old ledger sticking out from under a pile of magazines. It was Mom's personal diary from the last year of her life. I knew Marisol hadn't looked at it. She didn't have the patience for messy handwriting or the reality of Mom's pain. I picked it up, the leather cold against my palm. As I tucked it under my arm, I heard the heavy thud of the bedroom door closing. Marisol thought she had inherited a gold mine. She didn't realize she had inherited 30 years of secrets, and I was the only one who knew where the bodies were buried. I walked out to my car, the gravel crunching under my feet like breaking bone, and sat in the dark. I opened the ledger to the very last page. The entry wasn't about love. It wasn't about stability. It was a confession that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. The interior of my car was a stifling cocoon, the only light coming from the faint green glow of the dashboard. I turned on the overhead lamp, my heart hammering against my ribs. The handwriting on the final page of the ledger was jagged, a frantic departure from my mother's usual elegant script. It was written only 3 days before she slipped into the coma. Marisol found the letters, it read. She knows about Julian. She told me if I didn't fix the will, she'd tell Linnea everything. She said, Linnea, perfect world would burn. I'm so tired. I can't let Linnea know what I did. God forgive me, I have to choose the daughter who will keep the secret over the daughter who deserves the truth. The paper felt like it was scorching my fingertips. I didn't know a Julian. My father's name was Elias, a man who had died in a car accident when I was 4, leaving Mom to raise us alone on a nurse's salary. Or so I had been told for 30 years. I looked back at the cottage. Through the window, I saw Marisol's silhouette moving behind the thin curtains of the kitchen. She was dancing, a glass of wine in one hand, probably mentally spending the Airbnb revenue already. She wasn't just a beneficiary, she was a blackmailer. She hadn't won Mom's heart, she had held her peace of mind hostage. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. The grief that had been a heavy, suffocating blanket for months suddenly sharpened into a needle. Marisol thought she was the only one with leverage. She thought I was the stable one because I was too soft to fight back. She mistook my patience for weakness. I drove home in a trance, the dark trees blurring past like ghosts. My small apartment felt alien to me, too quiet, too full of the sensible furniture and organized shelves that Marisol mocked. I sat at my small dining table and pulled out the old shoe box of family photos I'd kept in the back of the closet. I searched through the grainy Polaroids of my childhood. There were dozens of Mom and me, then Mom and Marisol, but very few of Elias. In the few that existed, he was always tucked into the background, his face slightly out of focus. I began to look closer at the edges of the photos, the things people usually ignore. In a picture of my 5th birthday, there was a man's hand visible on the left side of the frame, resting on the back of Mom's chair. He was wearing a distinctive gold signet ring with a crest I didn't recognize. I went back to the ledger, flipping through the earlier months. I found a phone number scribbled in the margin of a grocery list from April, tucked between almond milk and stamps. I dialed it. My pulse was a dull thud in my ears. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was deep, cultured, and carried the unmistakable tremor of age. "Hello," he asked. "I'm looking for Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I heard the faint clink of ice against glass. "Who is this?" "I'm Linnea," I said, "Mina's daughter." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper. "I've been waiting 26 years for this call. Did she finally tell you?" "No," I said, looking at the ceramic bird on my table. "But I'm about to find out everything." Man on the other end of the line, Julian, didn't ask how I got his number. He didn't ask if Mom was okay. He simply gave me an address in a coastal town 3 hours away and told me to come at noon. "Bring the ledger," he added, his voice sounding like gravel under a slow tide. "If you have it, you have the map. I have the key." I didn't sleep. I spent the night packing my small living room, the floorboards groaning under my anxiety. I kept thinking about Marisol's face, that smug, entitlement-heavy look she wore as she tossed our mother's life into trash bags. She wasn't just taking a house. She had stolen my right to a peaceful morning, turning our mother's final days into a battlefield of extortion. At dawn, I drove. The highway was a gray ribbon cutting through the mist. As the sun rose, it didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Julian's house was a masterpiece of glass and cedar perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It was the kind of home that breathed old money, the kind of place Mom always joked people like us only saw in movies. As I walked up the stone path, the smell of salt and expensive mulch filled the air. The man who opened the door was tall, his back slightly bent by time, wearing a cashmere sweater the color of the sea. On his right hand, the gold signet ring from the photograph caught the morning light. "You have her eyes," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "But you have Elia's mouth, firm, stubborn." The interior was silent, filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. He led me to a study where 2 cups of tea were already steaming on a low table. "Marisol came here, didn't she?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. My skin felt tight, hypersensitive to the luxury around me, luxury bought with the silence my mother had kept. Julian sat down heavily. "She came 2 months ago. She was less than subtle. She told me she knew I was the one who had been sending scholarship funds to your mother for 20 years. She threatened to go to the press, to my wife, to my grandchildren. She wanted a lump sum to go away and leave my reputation intact." I felt a wave of nausea. The scholarships that had paid for our piano lessons, our dental work, and Marisol's failed semester at design school, it wasn't a state grant. It was hush money. "I refused," Julian said, staring into his tea. "I'm an old man, Linnea. I'm tired of hiding. I told her I'd rather face the fallout than give her a cent. So she went back to your mother. She told Mina that if she didn't get the house, the only asset that could be sold quickly for cash, she would destroy you by revealing that your hero, Father Elias, was actually a man who had agreed to raise another man's child for a monthly stipend." I looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks. The gift of stability wasn't a compliment. It was a prison sentence. Mom had sacrificed my inheritance to protect a lie she thought I needed. "She didn't just want the house, Julian," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "She wanted to win, and she thinks she has." I opened the ledger and laid it on the table between us. But Marisol forgot one thing. She's so focused on the money she can get, she doesn't realize what she's already lost. I looked at the man who was biologically my father, but a stranger to my heart. "I don't want your money. I want to know exactly how much Marisol asked you for. I need the numbers. I need the dates." Julian looked at me, a flicker of respect crossing his aged face. "Planning a ledger of your own?" "I'm planning an audit," I said, "and Marisol is deeply in debt." Julian reached into a mahogany desk drawer and pulled out a thin, leather-bound folder. He slid it across the table toward me. Inside were copies of wire transfers, bank statements, and most damning of all, a series of printed emails from an anonymous account that used phrases only Marisol would use. "She called herself the collector in these," Julian said with a grimace. "Very theatrical, very desperate." I scanned the numbers. Marisol had asked for $500,000 to keep his secret. When he'd blocked her, she'd pivoted back to the cottage, knowing that if she couldn't get Julian's millions, she could at least squeeze the equity out of our family's history. "Why did you do it?" I asked, looking up from the documents. "Not the money, the silence. Why let Elias take the credit for 26 years? Julian looked out at the horizon, his fingers trembling slightly as they touched the signet ring. "Because your mother loved him, Linnea, and he loved her enough to accept a child that wasn't his. I was a coward back then, tied to a family name and a marriage of convenience. Paying the bills was my way of sleeping at night. I thought I was helping. I didn't realize I was just building a wall between us." I stood up, the weight of the folder heavy in my hand. "You were, but Marisol is the one who decided to tear it down and use the bricks to hit us." I drove back toward the lake, the 3-hour journey feeling like minutes. My mind was a calculated blur of figures and timelines. I stopped at a small office supply store and bought a portable scanner. Then, I went to my apartment and spent 4 hours digitizing every receipt I had ever kept from Mom's care. The hospital bills I'd covered, the property taxes, the roof repair invoice, the grocery tallies. I wasn't just building a defense, I was building a trap. It was nearly sunset when I pulled back into the cottage driveway. The yellow convertible was gone, replaced by a shiny, late-model SUV with property management decals on the side. My heart hammered. She was moving fast. I walked inside and found Marisol standing in the kitchen with a man in a sharp suit. They were looking at the original hardwood floors. "And we can just sand these down, right?" Marisol was saying, her voice airy and bright. "I want that light, Scandi chic look. Get rid of all this heavy, dark junk." The heavy, dark junk was the dining table our grandfather had built. "The appraiser will be here Tuesday," the man said, nodding something on a tablet. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting through their conversation like a blade. Marisol spun around, her smile vanishing instantly. "Nee, I thought I made it clear. The locks are being changed tomorrow. You shouldn't even be here." "I'm not here for the furniture, Marisol," I said, walking to the kitchen island and laying the folder down next to her wine glass. "I'm here for the audit." She glanced at the folder, her face paling as she recognized the crest on the front. She quickly turned to the man in the suit. "Could you give us a minute, Marcus? Family stuff." As soon as the door closed behind him, Marisol hissed, "You went to see him. You had no right. That's my business." "Actually," I said, leaning against the counter, "it's a crime. It's called extortion, Marisol. And I have the wire transfer requests, the emails, and a very detailed statement from Julian about how you used this information to coerce Mom into changing her will." I stepped closer, watching the sweat break out on her upper lip. "Mom didn't leave you this house because she loved you more. She left it to you because she was terrified of you. And in this state, a will signed under duress or through illegal coercion is void." Marisol tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled gasp. "You think a judge will care. It's her signature, Nee. You have nothing." "I have enough to ensure you spend the next 5 years in a courtroom instead of an airbnb," I said quietly. "But I have something else, too." I pulled out a second sheet of paper, a formal demand for reimbursement of all property expenses I'd paid over the last decade. "If you want the house, you owe me $84,000 in back maintenance and taxes, paid in full, by Monday, or I file the police report for the extortion." The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the ticking of the clock Marisol had already marked for the trash. Marisol stared at the demand for $84,000 as if I'd handed her a death warrant. The bravado she'd worn like a designer coat for years began to fray at the seams. She looked from the paper to me, her mouth opening and closing, the rhythmic thumping of her heart almost visible in the pulse of her throat. "You're joking," she finally rasped. "84,000. You lived here too, Nee. You enjoyed the amenities. You don't get to charge me for being a daughter." "I lived here as a caregiver," I said, my voice as cold as the lake water in November. "I have the logs of the home health visits I performed because you wouldn't chip in for a nurse. I have the invoices for the structural repairs that kept this roof from caving in on Mom while you were in Bali. This isn't being a daughter, Marisol. This is an investment you're about to inherit the debt for." I walked over to the stove and turned on the kettle. The click-click-click of the igniter was the only sound in the room. I needed the mundane comfort of tea to keep my hands from shaking. I wasn't a shark. I was a woman who had been pushed into a corner until the only way out was to bite. "I don't have that kind of money," Marisol whispered. She sank into one of the mismatched kitchen chairs, her expensive SUV keys clattering on the table. "You know I don't. That's the whole point of the cottage. I was going to use the rental income to pay off my other obligations." "The credit cards, or the people you've been collecting from?" I asked, watching the steam begin to rise from the kettle. "Julian told me you were desperate, but I didn't realize you were this far underwater. Who else are you blackmailing, Marisol? Or is it just the people who were unlucky enough to love you?" She flinched. For a second, I saw a flash of the little girl she used to be, The one who would break a vase and then cry so hard that Mom would end up apologizing to her. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had traded her soul for a chance to never work a day in her life. "You won't call the police," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its edge. "You wouldn't do that to the family name. You're the good one, remember? You're the one who protects Mom's memory." "Mom's memory is in that ledger," I said, pointing to my bag. "And it says she chose a blackmailer over her own peace of mind. I'm not protecting a lie anymore, Marisol. I'm protecting the truth. And the truth is, you can't afford this house." I poured the water into a mug, the scent of chamomile filling the air. It felt like a mockery of a peaceful home. "Monday morning," I repeated. "Either you sign a quitclaim deed transferring your interest in the cottage to me in exchange for me dropping the debt and the criminal charges, or we go to court. And I'll make sure Julian's lawyers are there to help me." Marisol looked out the window at the twilight. The shadows of the birches were long and jagged, like reaching fingers. "You'd really take everything from me, your own sister." "I'm not taking anything," I said, taking a slow sip of the tea. "I'm just finally stopping you from taking anything else from me." She stood up abruptly, grabbing her bag. "This isn't over, Nee. You think you're so smart with your folders and your numbers, but you've always been the one Mom felt sorry for. Even at the end, she didn't trust you with the truth. She trusted me to keep it." She slammed the door so hard the ceramic bird on the counter rattled. I stood in the kitchen, alone in the house that was legally hers but spiritually mine, and felt the first wave of exhaustion hit me. I had won the first round, but I knew Marisol. When she was cornered, she didn't surrender. She looked for a way to burn the whole forest down. The weekend was a suffocating stretch of silence. I stayed at the cottage, sleeping on the sofa with the ledger tucked under my pillow like a talisman. I expected a lawyer's call, a screaming voicemail, or perhaps a tearful apology. Instead, I got nothing but the sound of the wind through the screen door and the occasional low groan of the house settling into the night. On Sunday evening, the silence broke. I was in the basement, checking the water heater, when I heard the heavy thud of footsteps overhead. It wasn't the light, airy click of Marisol's heels. It was the measured, heavy tread of work boots. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I crept up the stairs, my hand gripping a heavy metal flashlight. In the living room, two men I didn't recognize were hauling the mahogany sideboard, the one our father had supposedly bought for Mom on their 5th anniversary, toward the front door. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice cracking the stillness. The men stopped. One of them, a burly guy with a faded tattoo on his forearm, looked at a clipboard. "Estate liquidation, ma'am. Client said everything in the house has to be cleared out by tonight. We've got the truck out front." "The client, you mean Marisol?" "Ms. Marisol Vance, yeah. She said the property, being gutted for renovation, and the contents are to be sold to the warehouse in bulk." I looked past them. The yellow convertible was idling at the end of the driveway, and Marisol was leaning against the hood, wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun was nearly down. She was scrolling on her phone, looking as bored as if she were waiting for a bus. I ran out onto the porch. "Stop this. Marisol, we have an agreement pending." She didn't look up from her screen. "No, you have a demand, Nee. I have the title. And since I can't afford your debt, I decided to liquidate the assets to cover it. Isn't that what a good bookkeeper would suggest?" "This is Mom's life," I screamed, gesturing to the truck where the sideboard was being hoisted up. "That furniture, the books, the quilts, you're selling them for pennies to a liquidator." Marisol finally pushed off the car and walked toward me, her smile thin and venomous. "If I can't have the house as a Scandi Chic rental, you're not getting it as a museum of your martyrdom. You want the cottage, Nee? Fine, but you're going to get it empty. Bare floors, bare walls, and the smell of me everywhere." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like ice water down my spine. "I called a contractor, too. The ones who do demolition prep. They're coming tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. to rip out the cabinets and the built-ins. Since I can't afford the maintenance, I'm stripping it to the studs to lower the tax value before I hand you the keys." She was going to destroy the house to spite me. She knew the physical structure wasn't what I loved. It was the soul of the place, the memories etched into the wood. She was performing a psychological scorched earth policy. "You're sick," I whispered. "I'm a Vance," she snapped back, her eyes flashing. "We take what we want, and if we can't have it, we make sure nobody else wants it either. See you at the signing tomorrow, Nee. Hope you like the echoes." She hopped into her car and sped off, the gravel spraying against my shins. I turned back to the house. The liquidators were coming back in for the dining table. My throat felt tight, a sob threatening to break loose, but I forced it down. I looked at the ledger in my hand. Marisol thought she was stripping me of my history. She didn't realize that by emptying the house, she was finally clearing the space for me to see the one thing she'd missed. I walked back inside, past the movers, and headed straight for the master bedroom. There was a loose floorboard under Mom's vanity that I'd helped her fix years ago. If Marisol was going to gut the house, I had to get there first. The liquidators were loud, their heavy grunts and the screech of furniture dragging across the floor echoing through the hallway. They didn't care about the scratches they left on the pine. To them, this was just a job. To Marisol, it was a ritual of erasure. I ducked into the master bedroom and locked the door, the click of the bolt feeling like a final, desperate breath. The room felt cold. The bed was already gone, leaving a rectangular ghost of dust on the floor. I knelt by the corner where the vanity had stood for 40 years. My fingers fumbled, tracing the edge of the floorboard Mom had always told me was just a bit of character in an old house. I remembered her face when I was 10, how she'd panicked when I dropped a marble near this spot. I used the edge of the heavy flashlight to pry the wood up. It didn't groan. It yielded with a soft, dry snap. Beneath the board, nestled in the insulation, wasn't a stack of cash or jewelry. It was a small, rusted metal tackle box. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I pulled it out. It was light, too light to be gold, but heavy enough to hold a life. I opened the latch. Inside were 3 things: a stack of letters tied with a piece of blue yarn, a small velvet box, and a cassette tape with my name, Linnea, written on the plastic in Mom's faded script. I ignored the letters. I knew what they were, the paper trail of a love that had been bought and sold. I opened the velvet box. Inside was a ring, but not a signet ring. It was a simple silver band with a small, clear stone, worn thin from years of being hidden. And tucked behind the velvet lining was a folded scrap of paper. "Elias knew," it said. "He knew from the day I told him I was pregnant. He didn't take the money for himself, Linnea. He put it in a trust for you. He didn't want Julian's shadow to touch your light." A sob finally broke through my chest, hot and jagged. All this time, I thought Elias was a paid actor in my mother's lie. I thought his love was a transaction. But he had been protecting me from the truth, just as Mom had. They weren't hiding a shame, they were hiding a gift. The liquidators hammered on the bedroom door. "Ma'am, we need the wardrobe in there. Client says it's on the list." "Give me 5 minutes," I yelled, my voice thick. I looked at the cassette tape. The trust. If Elias had set up a trust for me with Julian's money, and Marisol had spent her life draining Mom's actual income, then the financial dynamic of this entire war was a lie. I stood up, the tackle box clutched to my chest. I realized then that Marisol hadn't just been blackmailing Mom for the house. She had been searching for this box. She knew about the trust. She didn't want the cottage because she was broke. She wanted to keep me from finding out that I was the one who actually had the foundation she so desperately craved. I opened the door. The movers stepped back, startled by the look on my face. I didn't look like the grieving, sensible daughter anymore. I looked like someone who had just found the deed to her own soul. "Take the wardrobe," I said, stepping past them. "Take everything. Leave the walls. You're going to need them for the crime scene tape." I walked out of the house, the cassette tape tight in my hand. I didn't go to my car. I went to the old shed in the back where my father's tools still sat, untouched. I needed a player, and I needed to hear his voice one last time before I ended this. The shed smelled of gasoline, sawdust, and the damp earth of 1,000 rainstorms. I found the old battery-operated radio cassette player tucked under a tarp, its plastic casing coated in a fine layer of gray grime. My hands were shaking so violently, I nearly dropped the tape as I slotted it in. The click of the play button felt like a hammer hitting an anvil in the heavy silence of the shed. At first, there was only the hiss of white noise, a sound like a distant ocean. Then, a throat cleared. "Linnea," he said. It was Elia's. His voice was younger than I remembered, vibrant and warm, lacking the rasp of the illness that would eventually take him. "If you're hearing this, it means you've found the box, and it probably means things have gotten complicated." I leaned my forehead against the workbench, the cold metal of a vice pressing into my skin. "I loved your mother more than I loved my own breath," his voice continued, punctuated by the soft chirping of crickets in the background of the recording. "And I loved you from the second she told me about you. Julian. He's just a bank account, Linnea. He's not a father. I made him sign over a trust for you, handled by a firm in the city, so you'd never have to depend on his charity. It's under your name, your middle name, Beatrice. It's been growing for 30 years. He paused, and I heard the sound of a match striking. "Your sister, Marisol, I worry about her. She has a hunger in her that nothing can fill. I saw her watching me when I hid the box. She was only 7, but she has eyes that see too much and understand too little. Promise me, Linnea, if she tries to take your piece, you use what I left you to buy it back. Don't let her burn the house just to see the flames." The tape ended with a soft, mechanical clunk. I stood in the dark, the silence of the shed now feeling like a fortress rather than a grave. Marisol hadn't just been blackmailing Mom. She had been trying to find the Beatrice Trust for decades. She hadn't been able to crack it because she didn't have the legal name or the key, the account number written on the back of the cassette insert. I walked out of the shed. The liquidators were finishing up, the truck packed to the brim with my mother's life. They had stripped the house bare. It looked like a hollowed-out skull in the moonlight. I didn't stop them. I didn't say a word. I went to my car and pulled out my laptop. I logged into the trust portal using the details on the tape. The balance wasn't just $84,000. It was nearly $400,000, enough to buy the cottage twice over, enough to pay for the best legal team in the state to dismantle Marisol's life piece by piece. I sent one text to Marisol. "I found the Beatrice file. See you at the house tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. for the demolition. Bring your lawyer. You're going to need him to explain where the scholarship money really went." I spent the rest of the night in the empty house, sitting on the floor of the living room. I didn't need furniture. I had the truth, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was afraid of the dark. The sun began to bleed over the lake, a pale, cold orange. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the yellow convertible screamed into the driveway, followed by a heavy demolition crew truck. Marisol stepped out, her face a mask of fury and terror. She looked at the empty house, then at me standing on the porch. "You're bluffing," she hissed as she stormed toward me. "There is no Beatrice file." "There's more than a file, Marisol," I said, holding up the rusted tackle box. "There's a paper trail of every cent you stole from Mom's accounts while she was dying, thinking you were finding my inheritance. You didn't realize you were just documenting your own fraud." Marisol stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, the dust from the demolition truck settling on her expensive shoes. Behind her, the crew began unloading sledgehammers and crowbars, the heavy metal clanging like a funeral bell. She looked at the tackle box in my hands, then at my face, and for the first time in our lives, she didn't have a witty comeback. The silence stretched, long and uncomfortable, until the lead contractor stepped forward. "We ready to start on the kitchen, Ms. Vance?" he asked, looking between us. "Wait," Marisol whispered, her eyes never leaving mine. "Just wait in the truck." She walked up the steps until she was standing inches from me. I could smell the stale wine and the sharp tang of her anxiety. "How much?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How much is in the trust?" "It's not for you, Marisol," I said quietly. "It was never for you. It was the price Julian paid for his absence and the gift Elias gave me for my presence. You spent years trying to find a way to steal it, but you were looking for a heist when you should have been looking for a family." I handed her a single sheet of paper, not a legal threat, but a voluntary surrender of her rights to the property. "Sign the cottage over to me. Now, I'll pay off your immediate debts to the liquidators, and I won't file the fraud charges regarding Mom's medical accounts. You walk away with your freedom, but you leave this place, and you leave me forever." Marisol looked at the empty house behind me. Without the furniture, without the warmth, it was just a shell of wood and glass. She realized then that the only power she ever had was the power to hurt me, and I was no longer feelable. She took the pen from my hand and signed the deed against the porch railing. Her signature was a messy, defeated scrawl. She handed it back, her hand trembling. "You always were the favorite," she spat, though there was no heat in it. Just a tired old lie she used to justify her own cruelty. "No," I said, tucking the paper into the tackle box. "I was just the one who stayed." I watched her get into her car. She didn't look back as she sped away, the yellow convertible disappearing into the trees. I told the demolition crew to leave, paying them for the full day just to go away. By noon, the lake was still. I sat on the back dock, the wood warm against my palms. The house was empty, yes. The furniture was gone, the walls were bare, and the echoes were loud. But as I sat there, listening to the water lap against the pilings, I didn't feel the weight of what I'd lost. I felt the lightness of what I'd saved. I would bring back the sideboard. I would find the quilts. I would rebuild the kitchen, not as a Scandi chic rental, but as a home where the truth didn't have to hide under floorboards. I pulled the small silver ring from the tackle box and slipped it onto my finger. It was thin and modest, but it fit perfectly. I looked at my reflection in the clear water of the lake, a woman who was no longer just the stable one or the reliable daughter. I was a woman who knew her worth, standing on a foundation that had been built with love, protected by a father who chose me, and finalized by my own hand. The sun climbed higher, turning the water into a sheet of diamonds. For the first time in 30 years, there were no secrets left in the woods. Just the wind, the water, and the quiet. Steady rhythm of a life finally my own.